Welcome back, everybody, to the ActCon conference. Our next speaker, Wil Brown. He is the national coordinator for the Common Ground movement and the founder of the alternative news site Awakened Citizen. He has helped organize successful protests on both the local and national level. Wil is very passionate about ending the police state and supports many anti-war initiatives. His areas of expertise are crowd psychology, organizational management, protest organizing, social media. He also possesses a deep desire to challenge the status quo. Ladies and gentlemen, Wil Brown.
Hey. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the first ever ActCon. Before we begin, I would like to thank Dan Johnson and the Solutions Institute for both attempting something that's never been done before and honoring me with the opportunity to speak at such a pivotal first ever event. I would also like to preface this discussion on crowd psychology by stating that I personally have no formal education on the topic. I do not have a degree in psychology, nor will I claim to have conducted any of my own social experiments. My conclusions are simply derived from my own understanding of the works of Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud, Gustave Le Bon, and from evaluating for myself the numerous experiments that have been conducted on the psychology of authority, social conformity, and, of course, propaganda. I would also like to thank my mentor, Aaron Hawkins of Storm Clouds Gathering, for contributing largely to my own understanding of these topics and for bringing such an important topic to my attention and to the attention of the entire activist community. If you would like to learn more about the topic of crowd psychology outside of this discussion, you can study these works just as I have and formulate your own opinions. So let's begin with a question. What is crowd psychology? And by studying The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon, it becomes clear that individuals, when part of a crowd, think and behave differently than they would if they were acting alone on their own. There are many aspects as to why this is, but instead of focusing on the why, instead we are going to focus on how it's being used as a weapon against us by the ruling elite. Crowd psychology is used to manipulate public opinion and behavior by carefully selecting which memes will be spread by current leaders and subsequently their followers. Many of you listening to this probably hear the word meme and no doubt will think of the hilarious cat pictures that you see floating around social media and on the internet. While these may be examples of a meme, this is not what the science of memetics actually is. A meme is an idea or mind virus, if you will, that can be spread from person to person, much like a gene is spread from parent to offspring. So a hypothetical question, or rhetorical question, I guess, have any of you out there ever bought a new car, drove down the road, and then noticed how many of the exact same model of the vehicle that you just bought are out there on the road? Most of us have experienced something like this before, and it's not that these cars didn't exist before you made your purchase, but rather that your brain merely hadn't been programmed to notice them before. This particular example that I just mentioned is referred to as an association meme, and this phenomenon is explained further by the emerging science of memetics. Other ways of influencing the crowd mentality are through group identities, belief systems, and social structures. The most prominent example that comes to mind from this class are group identities. As many of you are aware, ideas don't always have to have logic or facts supporting them in order to spread, unfortunately. If you can cause an individual to experience an identity response when presented with such information, it can allow ideas to spread with an even greater fervor than if you had provided sound science and logic to support your claims. This is greatly evident, at least to me, in the anti-war movement and partisan politics. The very same liberal Democrats that were vehemently against George Bush and his foreign policy are the same ones who now make excuses for Obama and his expansion of the drone program and other current conflicts we are engaged in the Middle East. When you appeal to a group's identity during a discussion or debate, you're not necessarily debating the beliefs of that particular individual, but rather the stance that is taken by the collective of the identity that you are challenging. So the more you challenge that person's identity, the more they feel the need to defend it. The harsher they defend it, and then the process just continues. All you're doing when you attack someone's group identity is just set them further down in their own beliefs. They're less likely to listen to your opinion after that. So therefore, it becomes abundantly clear that we, as activists, need to boil our identities down to the lowest common denominator, and that is the fact that we are all human beings. Because we have allowed ourselves to be divided by our group identities. We consider and call ourselves Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, anarcho-capitalists, voluntarists, anarchists, Christians, atheists, Muslims, etc. And I think it's important, in order to understand how this happened, to first take a brief look at history. So Edward Bernays, who is considered to be the father of propaganda, was a member of the Committee of Public Information back in 1917. So this is way back. The sole purpose of the CPI was to build support of World War I among the American people. Bernays studied the mindset of the American people, and based on his findings, he created a propaganda campaign to promote the idea that America's purpose in World War I was to make the world safe for democracy. Bernays subscribed to a school of thought put forth by Gustave Le Bon, and Le Bon's most famous work was called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. And in this book, Le Bon presents an in-depth breakdown of crowd psychology, and he also outlines a very specific set of principles that, if followed by world leaders, would allow them to spark ideological contagion and then rise to power. Hitler and Mussolini both studied Le Bon's writing and used them in their own ambitions, and the results they attained were obviously those very results that Gustave Le Bon himself predicted in his own writings. So we can conclude from this that what happened in Nazi Germany with the Jews was no accident, but rather a carefully calculated campaign ran by Hitler and the closest members of his cabinet from the very beginning. So after his success with World War I and the propaganda during, Bernays decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peacetime. Bernays then went on to create some of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history, some of which resulted in the popularization of women smoking and the use of sodium fluoride in the municipal water supplies, just to name a few. Of course, we call this today, or we consider this today, to simply be marketing. So why is all this significant to crowd psychology and how it's being used against us today? The 21st century has made it significantly easier for those who wish to manipulate public opinion to do so. Today, there are 1,500 newspapers and 1,500 TV stations, all owned by just 6 corporations. Public opinion is now a commodity that can be bought and sold to the highest bidder, and corporations hire marketing firms and public relations teams to influence our opinion, and they've become so good at it that we don't even realize that it's happening most of the time. Nearly every single aspect of our daily lives is affected by crowd psychology. So we see crowd psychology being used in activism against us as activists through the use of agent provocateurs during protests and rallies. The use of agent provocateurs is widely documented in countries all over the world. Of course, not every single event is hijacked by an agent provocateur, but also through individual provocateurs that act alone for their own personal and selfish motives. This doesn't always work. It doesn't work 100% of the time. And we have evidence of crowds in recent history behaving slightly out of character when compared to Le Bon's studies and predictions. So, we're subconsciously fighting back, and this is clearly evident this was clearly evident during the Ferguson protests. Despite the nonstop coverage of the isolated acts of destruction in Ferguson, we know that a vast majority of the protests in Ferguson were, in fact, peaceful. The small number of looters and people causing property damage was not enough to influence the crowd that easily could have burned the entire city to the ground to do so, and it could have easily happened. So I know that the picture that I just painted, the stuff that I just went over, it looks pretty grim, but there are actually steps that we can take to ensure that we're not being manipulated in activism in the future. So a couple of techniques is ranging from when you're in an internet debate to all the way when you're out in real world, real life activism. When you're engaging in a debate on the internet, just ask yourself, am I being offended by the information that's being presented because he or she is challenging one of my group identities? Am I giving an identity response? And then further, when you're attending a large protest, you just simply ask yourself, is this a way I would have conducted on my own? And by constantly checking yourself mentally, and providing yourself with your own sort of checks and balances, so to speak, you leave yourself less susceptible to manipulation. Another thing that we can do, and this is probably the most important thing, is to further educate ourselves. Edward Bernays himself said, and this is a quote from his book, Propaganda, that was written in the 1920s, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute what he calls an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It's clear that the understanding of crowd psychology is a weapon. And like most weapons, it can be used for good and it can be used for evil purposes. Unfortunately, throughout history, most of the examples that we have to reflect on involving crowd psychology are examples where crowd psychology and the understanding of it have been used to commit evil. But we also have a few examples of how crowd psychology can be used for good. Martin Luther King, for example, is a great example of someone who used crowd psychology. Whether he had studied Le Bon or not is irrelevant. He was manipulating crowds, and he was doing it for good. Crowd psychology is easily one of the most important pillars of power that the state rests upon. And if even a few of us begin to understand and implement these concepts, we could seriously begin to undermine the entire structure. It's up to us to remind ourselves daily and often that in the age of information, ignorance is a choice. So that's the end of this discussion. Thank you for tuning in. I believe we're going to go to a Q&A session here.
Yeah, Will, hey, thanks a lot. That's a great presentation. And yes, we do have some questions for you. From our chat room, our chat wing, Fija would like to ask, any tips on getting activists to consider how their actions look to the general public rather than just to themselves through their own liberty filters?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and that's something that and has been brought up, especially with these recent protests, where people are, blocking off roadways and stuff like that. It causes an impedance in traffic, and people can't get to work. And I think the mentality of that is more to say, oh, you need to look. But I think also it can have a negative effect where people don't really care. They have jobs to go do, and they may or may not be late for appointments. So we can be more calculated in who we target with our protests, if that makes sense. So maybe rather, and I'm not saying that, shutting down a highway is ineffective. It's very effective. It gets a lot of news coverage, but if you're doing it every day, people just get tired of it, and it kind of waters down your message. So instead of, targeting, those who are affected by some of these issues, maybe target those people who are causing them. So instead of blocking a highway, maybe get a group of you and, form a human chain around a public building, or maybe your Capitol downtown, and make sure you do it non-violently, and just make sure that you let everybody know that none of the politicians come to work or get to work until we actually have a sit-down discussion about some of our demands. So I think a little more selective targeting of the groups that we actually want to bring it to, rather than those who are affected by these issues.
Fantastic. Let's say I want to market a gun rights group. My audience is gun owners, and I want to create legislative action on gun issues. What are some of the things I should keep in mind?
Well, some of the things that you can keep in mind is, especially if you're looking to target gun owners specifically, that's definitely a niche. It's a niche mentality. So kind of immersing yourself in their culture and finding a little bit about the terminology that they use is largely important, because if you're going to target a pro-gun rally differently if you're trying to get like more liberal-minded people to come around to the idea of gun ownership, than you would if you're just trying to simply target people. So things like defense against tyranny, things like that. These are all like what are considered buzz phrases, and they just really resonate with that whole pro Second Amendment crowd. So I think anytime that you're going to try to appeal to a specific group, just immerse yourself in their culture a little bit, find out some of the things that really make them tick, and then you can kind of structure a marketing campaign around things that that will appeal to those people.
That's great. All right, let's see. Why is crowd psychology even important?
Without, I mean, with the ruling elite, they currently have the ability to manipulate the crowd, right? It's like I said in my discussion, is that they've got us all divided, and without these political parties and things that are designed specifically with the intention of dividing us, we would be able to look at each other and say, hey, we have more in common than we do, than we don't. So like, hey, let's work together, and these are the guys that we actually want to bring it to, rather than each other. But when we when they get us focusing more on social issues, they divide us up into all these different, social classes and social identities, and makes us look at each other and say, hey, that guy down the street who voted for Obama is my enemy. When it's not, it's, Obama, it's Bush, it's all of these people who are actually pushing this type of legislation out into the public. Those are the enemies. But when they can distract us and focus on each other, it makes us less likely to unite, and then we can actually launch an efficient counterattack.
Fantastic. A question in our chat wing from Fija. We have some issues with people who use Fija literature in their direct actions, but don't follow our guidelines and wind up getting arrested. This has dissuaded other volunteers because they think our work is illegal and fear for their safety. Do you have any thoughts on how we can overcome this?
Yeah, this is actually a really, really hard topic, and this is something that we struggled with in the beginning when we were finalizing the idea of the Common Ground movement. And what we ended up doing is we created 3 very specific rules of engagement, and we advertised them everywhere. Anytime our group was being advertised, our rules of engagement. So people now know that, yes, Common Ground movement is it is a revolutionary movement, but they've been very specific from the beginning about making sure that they let everybody know that they were a nonviolent group. So I mean, you're always going to have groups that hijack, and they try to use your group and your ideas for their own benefit. That's just something that we're going to have in activism. But I think the number one way to combat that is being very clear and upfront wherever you have literature or you have a website that you are putting in like fine print somewhere what your rules of engagement are, and just saying that anybody who violates these rules of engagement, they are not part of us. They can use our literature and claim to be part of us, but we say this and this and this, and if somebody violates that, pure and simple, they're just not us. They're not part of us, and you just shun them as vehemently as possible. And after a while, when your group starts gaining notoriety, people will be able to sift through who's the real group and who are kind of some of the people who are trying to hijack the movement.
Perfect. Perfect. Next question for you. Who are some of the most famous crowd psychologists and what effect did they have?
Well, like I said, Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud, Gustave Le Bon, those are the big major ones. Gustave Le Bon really paved the way for crowd psychology. Before Gustave Le Bon, there was no comprehensive work out there on the difference between individual psychology and crowd psychology. There is a huge difference, and even in today's time, crowd psychology is one of the most overlooked and underrated aspects of society. But I think some of the people who are bringing it to attention today are anybody who's involved with the science of memetics. That's a pioneering science. It's an emerging science. And the more that we get information out on that, it helps people realize that, yeah, we actually are being manipulated, and it's on a neurological level. Like, people don't understand that they aren't the way that crowd psychology works is that it's not even you don't even realize you're being manipulated, and that's the most effective types of propaganda. And like I said, for Edward Bernays to be able to simply come home and just play with society the way he did, make it to where Alcoa, he marketed for Alcoa to have their waste, sodium fluoride waste, being dumped in the municipal water supplies. He even convinced Americans to eat a bigger breakfast to increase bacon sales. So all of these things come into play. And I think right now, Aaron Hawkins from Storm Clouds Gathering is really, really pioneering the modern day understanding of crowd psychology.
That's interesting. I actually follow Aaron closely too, as a lot of us do here, and you obviously do. And I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but that it does make a lot of sense. Absolutely. Last question. We're coming up on last couple of minutes. To my knowledge, there are 4 phases each crowd goes through, each with their various importance. Can you explain what they are?
Well, I am not sure exactly what the 4 are that you're referring to, but I know that. Are you talking about in terms of like revolution or?
Yes.
Okay. So the first phase obviously is the ideological revolution, and I'm only aware of 3 phases. So the first phase is the ideological revolution, where people understand that they're being manipulated, and they're kind of combating crowd psychology in their own way. The second is spreading that ideological contagion, and then the third, I believe, is like through acts of strategic non-compliance. And if any of you out there listening are interested in learning more about strategic non-compliance, Gene Sharp's book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, is fantastic. I'm not an advocate of democratic systems, so just disregard the name. The tactics within still apply. There's like 198 examples of nonviolent or civil disobedience, things that you can use. And obviously, those 198 aren't, that's not all of the tactics for civil disobedience that you can use, but it's a huge start. I'd highly recommend going out and reading that book. If we go out and we decide that we want to wage war against our current system with violence, it's just not going to work. Obviously, militarily, our government is strongest with its military, and so attacking your enemy where it's strongest just doesn't make any tactical sense at all whatsoever. However, exploiting them where they're weakest, that's totally doable. And by undermining the crowd psychology and these types of discussions that we're having is a really, really good way to do that.
Today's ActCon conference. Definitely look forward to working with you more in Solutions Institute. Glad you are an advisor, and great presentation, and look forward to seeing more of you.